In the 1500s, when Spanish explorer Francisco Vázquez de Coronado traveled northward in his search for gold, he came across the Wichita people in North America. Their homes were huts of grass, well built and symmetrically proportionate. Symmetry in architecture was, prior to this, believed to be a purely European concept attributed to Vitruvius. The concept of symmetry, it would seem, was universal. This is not a surprising find in all actuality. Vitruvius himself claimed architecture was an imitation of nature, and nature is filled with symmetry, from a honeycomb cell, to a leaf, to a galaxy. Symmetry in video game design is extraordinarily common. It logically makes sense that in order to balance multiplayer experience, giving players the same abilities makes a great deal of sense and is a highly efficient method. But as with symmetry in architecture leading to modernism's rejection and purposeful asymmetrical designs to thumb their nose at convention, so too there must be asymmetrical video games that are designed to give completely different play experiences depending upon who you are on which side of the coin. Today, we will analyze asymmetrical multiplayer games in all their glory, from the earliest to the latest. What's their history? What makes them work? And finally, what is their future? I'm your host, Derek Laporte, and this is a homework assignment. JFK, in giving his famous Moon speech on September 12, 1962 at Rice Stadium, foresaw computers for home, but we would reach the moon before that became a reality. Regardless, the march of technology throughout time has always led to achievements in new leisure activities, and computers would be no different. The year is 1982. Over the last 3 years, more than 3 million personal computers were sold in America. It was finally making its mark, so much so that on December 26th, Time magazine would name the first ever inanimate object for its Man of the Year, the personal computer. It's in this maelstrom of incredible technology that our first asymmetrical multiplayer video game is released. Its name, Nautilus. Its system, the Atari 8-bit computer. Nautilus was created by Mike Potter, aka Micro Mike, and published by Synapse Software Corporation. Not only was this game the first asymmetrical multiplayer game, it was also the first split-screen game. The gameplay is as such. The player on the bottom of the screen controls a submarine and attempts to destroy underwater structures, while the top screen player controls a ship that can drop depth charges while attempting to repair the underwater structures that the other player is destroying. But the top player lacks the ability to submerge and has to stay on the surface of the water at all times. By having competing goals in addition to unique skills, players engage in a tug of war, each trying to get the upper hand and must account for the other player's abilities. This also aids in the replayability of the game.
But this is no ordinary disc, just 12 centimeters in diameter. The music is recorded onto it digitally, and there's no needle being dragged through a groove. That information is being read by a laser light.
If I owned this store, I'd get rid of all these video games and just stock this one, the Atari 2600. Because if you've got an Atari, you can play...
G.I. Joe Cobra Strike for the Atari 2600 was the next asymmetrical multiplayer game. Developed by John Emerson and released by Parker Brothers in 1983, Cobra Strike has one player controlling an enormous cobra that fires lasers and venom and needs to attempt to hit the recruits running across the bottom of the screen. Meanwhile, the other player controls a shield to defend the recruits and a gun to fire back at the snake. Interestingly, the game even had a 3-player mode, where one player controls a snake and the other 2 players defend the recruits.
Introducing the new taste of Coca-Cola. In this country, the best have a way of getting better, and Coke just did.
I told you I would get you. The back of the I told you I would find
In 1985, in the US, Duck Hunt was released for the Nintendo Entertainment System. Published by Nintendo and produced by Gunpei Yokoi, it was not primarily an asymmetrical game. However, it did include a mode known as Game A. Game A would allow the second player to control the duck on screen using the controller, while player 1 attempts to shoot the duck with the light gun.
Growing again. You'll love the way your hair grows before your eyes.
3 years later, in 1988, Eight Eyes was released on the Nintendo. Developed by Thinking Rabbit and published by Sega, Eight Eyes is an early Metroidvania with a 2-player mode that has the second player controlling a pet falcon. The mode allows the player greater flight capabilities and a unique attack system different from the main character Auron. Now, you may notice, these last 2 examples had additional modes that were asymmetrical multiplayer, but were not the primary focus of the game. This becomes a trend that occurs for the next 11 years. Why exactly is it the case that asymmetrical multiplayer was relegated to the back burner of game design, consigned to being a mere mode for overtly inquisitive gamers? In other words, why was asymmetrical multiplayer not considered alluring enough to garner a release all to its own? Interestingly, the answer to that question can be found more than a century ago.
So you finally decided to find out what all this internet stuff is about.
What game will they play next?
In 1898, philosopher and naturalist Carl Groos wrote in The Play of Animals about the form of tag that animals play. Tag is, of course, the very first asymmetrical game ever played. In its most basic version, the roles of tag are chase or evade. Groos found that natural selection shaped animals to enjoy the act of evading during play more so than chasing. The role of the chaser was much less satisfying. The same can be said for children. The role of it is always regarded as undesirable, even though it's the most important role in the game, and children experience the most joy evading the chaser as opposed to being the chaser.
paper trails on a mountain.
This concept extends well into adult life. Take, for instance, American football. How many offensive players in football can you name? How about defensive players? Don't feel bad, just take a look at the NFL salary caps of offense versus defense. For most teams, it's not even close. There's a clear bias towards offense. Offensive football players are paid more than defensive players, with a few exceptions. This in spite of the fact everybody knows defense wins championships. So what's up with that? Well, if we broke football down to tag, we would find that offensive players actually fill the role of the chased, while defensive players play the role of the pursuer. And this explains that even amongst the most knowledgeable of the sport, still the evolutionary bias of vicariously experiencing joy through a stunning evasion is more desirable. With video games, developers are allowed to give the undesirable role of the pursuer to the computer and allow all players to experience the more instinctually joyful role of the pursued. And it would take several years before a game would really make inroads to bring asymmetrical multiplayer back to the forefront. It would come due to an inspiration from another art form that will continue to inspire the genre. Released for PC and developed by Rebellion Developments and published by Fox Interactive and Electronic Arts, Alien vs. Predator had a multiplayer component that allowed players to pick between Marine, Alien, or Predator. Each had unique abilities and a unique look. Three years later, in 2002, Natural Selection was released. Designed by Charlie Cleveland and released on PC as a mod for Half-Life, it shares similarities with AVP in that players can choose a Marine or Alien. However, its concept is more refined. It blends FPS and RTS elements and was one of the first to incorporate a commander, a player who views the battlefield top-down and handles placements and upgrades. Ten years later, Natural Selection 2 would be released as a standalone for PC. Considered to be the earliest entry into the modern asymmetrical online multiplayer, Natural Selection 2 expands on its prior version by making the gameplay differences between aliens and marines more pronounced, but the seminal releases in the genre to date were just a few years away.
Goliath is a physical brute with powerful melee abilities. Use the smell ability to highlight nearby hunters and wildlife. Melee attacks are very effective at close range. Eat to gain armor and evolve.
Set for its 2015 release, the excitement for Evolve was huge. Developed by Turtle Rock Studios coming off of Left 4 Dead, it was 4 versus 1 multiplayer, with the single player controlling an overpowered monster. The monster could evolve to become even more overpowered, while the other 4 players, called Hunters, would need to hunt the player down before it got any stronger. But in Evolve's version of Tag, 4 players are it and 1 player is being chased. And as we discussed earlier, the hunt isn't as joyful as the evasion. So when developers flipped the script of Evolve was when the niche genre really arrived at its turning point. Dead by Daylight, released cross-platform in 2017 and developed by Behavior Interactive, takes its cue from slasher horror films. 1 player is the relentless killer, while 4 other players work together to escape or survive the night. To date, it is the game that defines the modern asymmetrical multiplayer genre. Another cross-platform release that came out the same year, Friday the 13th, developed by Ilphonic and Black Tower Studios and published by Gun Media, sees one player playing as Jason and stalking 7 players who are counselors as they try and escape or survive 20 minutes. The game includes an 8th counselor, Tommy Jarvis, that a dead or escaped player will return as. The game includes a single way to kill Jason, involving many steps and perfectly timed sequences. Ilphonic went on to develop the PS4 exclusive Predator Hunting Grounds for Sony. It was released in April 2020. A 1v4 multiplayer game, it's closer to Evolve than Friday the 13th, as there are additional bots and various unlocks within the game. Also in April 2020, Capcom released Resident Evil Resistance, a multiplayer game where one player is the mastermind attempting to thwart 4 other players from escaping. It's received mixed reviews, but proves the fact that larger publishers are beginning to test the waters of asymmetrical multiplayer, even if the balance is not right yet. A slightly different take, and perhaps a throwback to old-school asymmetrical multiplayer, Joe Williams developed Who's Your Daddy, a 1v1 game where the symmetry is in the competing goals. One player is the dad attempting to keep the baby safe, while the other player is the baby trying to kill itself. A remake is due December 2020. As we've seen with this list, asymmetry is primarily competing goals in games, but the genre lately has had 2 additional traits. One player versus many players, and the lone player has unique, overpowered abilities that don't give a lot of hope to the others. This is in keeping with the horror genre conventions, which, for better or worse, is where asymmetrical multiplayer is right now. What is the future of asymmetrical multiplayer games? Likely it's embracing the more comical roots of the genre. Additionally, developing unique classes that require differentiated skills, meaning a player has to specialize along a certain path and fits a specified role and is kind of locked into that role. As film becomes an increasingly common inspiration for video games, perhaps video games will grow into its own art form, using the interactivity to not just heighten or emulate. In the words of Carl Groos, if we ask how aesthetic enjoyment extends its sway beyond the entire sphere of play, we encroach on the ethical bearings of art. With the introduction of an element of moral elevation and profound insight into life, aesthetic satisfaction ceases to be mere play and transcends beyond the bounds of its vesture. And finally, we must ask, if being chased is joyful, then what are we running from?
Hit radio in the bar. 10. Hit radio in the bar. 10. Hit radio in the bar. 10. 9.